Good morning. Pastor Brian asked me to pass along greetings from him when I had a conversation with him this morning. So greetings from Pastor Brian, who was lounging in Texas, and he said in a smoldering hot day. So welcome to Haven. What's the best message you've ever received? Like, did you ever get a message where it's like it fundamentally changed something for you, even though nothing actually changed other than you just got the message? Yes, fantastic. There's something about receiving a message that changes something for us. So today, I am confident that I am going to bring the best message that I've ever brought. And I'm confident it's going to be the best message that you've ever heard. And it has absolutely nothing to do with how I deliver it. I'm not actually talking about anything I'm going to do. I'm talking about the message, not about the person who's delivering it, not the way it gets delivered, but the actual message, because messages fundamentally can change us. I was asked this morning, Don Hamparian asked this message. If you ever have the privilege of preaching here, be prepared that Don will ask you, what's your takeaway point? I don't like that question because I like theory and I just like ideas and I just like to talk. And why do we have to be practical about everything? And so I was thinking about the takeaway this morning is just simply a message. I don't even want you to think about application, what you're going to do with it. I just want you to hear the message. Can you imagine on 9/11 if you knew that your loved one had a ticket on Flight 93? And you got the news about what happened, and you're watching the news. And hours later, you get a message. Traffic was horrible. I missed my flight. Does something change in that moment with that message? Everything changes. What's different in your circumstances? Not a whole lot. Just the message fundamentally changes something. So here's the message that I want you to hear. It's a one-point sermon. Jesus stands alive on both sides of death. That's the message. Jesus stands alive on this side of death, and he stands alive on this side of death. On both sides, Jesus is alive. I believe that message has fundamentally changed the course of human history. It's fundamentally the message that changes individual lives. It fundamentally transforms the way we live. And it's just a message. It's the message that Jesus is alive on both sides. Do you believe it? Yeah. Well, like if we say we follow Christ, that's the fundamental belief of the Christian faith, is that Jesus stands alive on both sides. But do we really believe it? Or do we struggle through life? And so we're going to look in John chapter 11 today at a story of Lazarus dying and Jesus raising him from the dead, and we're going to see if we can't draw some stuff out of that. But before we do that, let's go back to the very beginning. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. Death is the ultimate reality for fallen humanity. For when you eat of this fruit, Scripture says, in that day you will certainly die. Well, we are not dead. Adam and Eve didn't die the way we think about death, and yet they did. Death became their ultimate reality. It's the thing that oriented the entirety of human history. Death now swallows up life. Life just gets swallowed up by death, the fear of death. Psychiatrist Irvin Yalom, he's sometimes considered the founder of the counseling field. He said, he was an atheist, and he said, the fear of death, that is the only thing that brings people into the counseling office. Everything coming into the counseling office is about the fear of death. What he was getting at is that's fundamental reality of human history. It's the thing that orients our lives because it's our ultimate reality. Our broken, fallen human world, death is the final word. And if you think about it, we're oriented that way. Think about this piece of paper. I'm going to crease it. This paper is bent, and it will never be unbent completely. It will always be vulnerable to folding on this line. And the more I crease it, the more weak it becomes, the more it is going to fold on that line. That's death for humanity. Everything folds on that line. Everything that makes us anxious, everything that makes us afraid, everything that hurts us is being folded on that line of death is our ultimate reality. And that's not a good message. That's a bad message. It's a sad message. It's a scary message. It's a message that you don't really want to think about very much. How many of you are already uncomfortable having me say it so many times? Yeah, it's like the idea of that we cannot get away from the reality is that death swallows up life. It extinguishes it. Yep. It'll tear apart. It does. And death does it. It tears us apart. How many of you have ever been torn apart by death? By somebody dying. It tears us apart. If you're a hockey fan, you heard a tragic story this week about two brothers just run over on their bicycles as they were riding, killed the day before their sister's wedding. Death swallows up life. It swallows it up. Just a few weeks ago, we had the privilege of having a family member in our home. Several years ago, their young son died of cancer. And they buried their son, they buried their brother, and just a short time later, they buried their mom. And so this husband, his father, and his remaining kids are sitting at our kitchen table. It's like death swallowed up life. It's scary, it's hard, it's depressing, but it's our reality. And one of the things that Christians always do is they steadfastly look into reality because the gospel of Jesus faces reality. And the message today is that Jesus stands on both sides of death, but he does more than that. He actually goes through it. It's like we're not alone in it, and that's good news. Because what's going to happen is we're going to change the orientation. We're not going to be oriented to death and suffering. That's not the end. So let's look at how we orient our lives around death and human suffering. So we do positive things. Like we have good financial stewardship. How many people do you think save a lot of money in their lives because they're terrified of death, of human suffering, and they think that they're going to be able to buy themselves out of their pain and their suffering? Many of us would say, yeah, that's kind of why I'm saving. It's like, if you want to catch me in my most anxious moments, it's that I'm pretty certain I don't have a secure retirement. I'm pretty sure I don't have enough and I won't have enough. That's based on the metrics that all the financial advisors give, I really have been very, very undisciplined. I haven't been thrifty enough. I haven't saved enough. And so we do good things because of our fear of death. Health and wellness. We manage our risk and rewards. We use self-denial. We try to prevent things. We turn towards relationships to have good relationships because we're afraid. We're oriented around death. Now, we're often not thinking about those things as our fear of death, but it's the motivating factor for many of us behind the good things that we do. We can also talk about the negative side of things, the vices that we get involved with, wasteful gambling. We try to just manage our illnesses, and we go from sickness to sickness rather than attending to our health. We take too many risks, or we're too risk adverse. Or we turn to our hedonism and just the pursuit of pleasure, and so we just can forget about the realities of our orientation towards death. Our anxieties and our worries and our isolation, all of these things often are driven by our fear of this ultimate reality. And then comes the Apostle John, and he's going to pen this story and this book. And he says this in John 20. He said, "These things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing in his name you may have life." That you may have life. He's not just talking about just staying alive. He's talking about a change of orientation. He's talking about a message that fundamentally changes the way we go through our suffering, the way we go through life on this earth, and he fills us with hope because Jesus stands alive on both sides. Belief in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, is what changes our ultimate reality from death to life. Rather than the bentness of our paper, you can almost think of our faith is that Jesus comes and he straightens out our paper and he laminates it. And it doesn't fold in that line anymore. We're not oriented that way. And yet, while we're still alive, we will always grapple with the reality that that was our orientation. That is the struggle of the Christian life. And John's going to tell us about 4 obstacles to belief. And then we're going to attach some lessons to that. So we can think about it as an existential problem. An existential problem is just the problems that go on in real life. It's just the fears and the worries and the anxieties of the world. The philosophical problem is if God is really all powerful and all loving and all these kinds of things, then why does he let these things happen to us? These are philosophical questions, deep questions. Who am I and how do I fit in the world? And Jesus meets us in that space of the philosophical. Then there's the emotional problems. Do you really care about me? Like I don't feel it, so I'm not certain it's real. But he will share in our suffering. And then there's the pragmatic objection. That's the one where we're just really evaluating, is it practical? Is following Jesus really the practical thing to do? Oftentimes, it doesn't seem practical because we're oriented to death. What Jesus invites us to do, if we get it straight in our heads and in our hearts, that Jesus stands on both sides of death, we'll do what he says. And we'll do it with confidence because he's standing alive over here. And that's the person we want to follow. So let's look at the story. John chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 8 through 10. This is the existential objection that the disciples had. So Lazarus is sick. Lazarus is a good friend of Jesus. He has 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. And Lazarus, they supported Jesus. They were very close friends of Jesus. And he's sick unto death. And his sister sent a message to Jesus and says, that your friend is dying. He's very sick. And Jesus doesn't do anything. He stays right where he is, doesn't leave, doesn't go to be with his friend. And then he dies. And Jesus then says to his disciples, all right, we're going to go over to Lazarus because he's dead and I'm going to wake him up. I'm paraphrasing. But that's the essence of the story. Jesus tells the disciples, Lazarus died and I'm going to go wake him up. And guess what the disciples say? That's not a really good idea because we were just over there and the Pharisees tried to stone you. How about we not go? Because they're terrified because death is ultimate reality for them. They're only learning that Jesus stands alive on both sides. They don't know that yet. They're only coming, they're getting these glimpses. I think this is the guy I want to follow. I think this is the Messiah, but I'm not certain. And how about we don't go? And Jesus says, well, we're going. And let's go. And then Thomas says, well, we might as well go with him and die. Like here, this is the end. We've thrown in our lot, so let's go and die with him. You see, Jesus then says to them, let's go because it's safe to walk in the light. It's dangerous to walk in the darkness. In the darkness, you will stumble and fall. But if you take steps in the light, you're going to be fine. This is what Jesus is saying to us in our fears and in our anxieties and our worries. He says, wherever the light shines, take a next step. The light doesn't shine on the whole path. You have enough light to take a step. Take a step in the light and you'll be fine. Just do it incrementally. Just move into your fears. Step into it. Don't be afraid. Just step into the light. And that was his message about how to overcome the existential fears and the worries of life. Just take a step. Move towards him. So they're on their way to Lazarus. As they're getting closer, the word goes out in front of them that Jesus is on his way. And Martha gets up and she goes out to meet him. Now Martha, she's an interesting person in the scriptures. Let's read it. Let's jump to the next slide. Yeah. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. If you remember Martha in the Bible, she's coming with her objections. Like, she's coming out to him. Like, she's not holding back. She's not the woman that holds back. She goes out and she meets him. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's a statement of I don't get it. You're not making sense to me. You say that you love us, you say all of these things, but why in the world did you just not come sooner? Because had you come, then we'd be fine. But death has already swallowed up life, so now we're not going to be fine. I'm not okay. But there's this hint in her faith that's really powerful. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again in about 10 minutes. She doesn't know that, and she says, I know he'll rise in the resurrection at the last day. And then Jesus says this fantastic piece, I am the resurrection and the life. I am on both sides of death. I am on both sides of your suffering. I am right here, right now. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? What Jesus is saying is death is not going to be your ultimate reality anymore. You believe in me and you will never die. You will never have to orient your life to death again. You do not have to organize your life around your fears, around your anxieties, around the realities of human suffering, because I'm alive on both sides and you can go through. It doesn't mean we won't suffer. It doesn't mean we won't grieve. But what Jesus is saying is that I am here and I am going to swallow up death. Life is about to swallow up death. And that message will change your life completely. The message is, and she said, do you believe this? And then her response was exactly the same thing that Peter said to Jesus one other time. I believe that you are the Christ, or you are the Messiah, the Son of God who has come into the world. That's the fundamental belief. That's I believe in you, Jesus. See, our philosophical questions, Jesus never answers them with the answers that we prefer. He answers them in relationship. Your questions probably won't get the answers that you want, but he will encounter you. Jesus will encounter you in your philosophical questions, in those deep questions. It's a hit and miss process, though, because later in the story, they get to the tomb where they buried Lazarus, and he says, how about you take away the stone? And guess what Martha does? She pipes up. She just got done saying what she said. It kind of reminds me of Peter when he said, you are the Christ, the Son of God, and Jesus goes on, and Peter says, oh, Jesus, no, that's you dying, that's not a good idea. And Jesus turns to him and says, get thee behind me, Satan. It's like we struggle on this side. The disciples struggled, Martha struggled. They pronounced that I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I believe that Jesus stands on both sides of death. And then, hey, Lord, he's been in the grave for 4 days and he stinks. This is not a good idea. And Jesus turns to her and says, what did I tell you? Just believe. Don't go back to your... When you struggle with your philosophical questions, just keep going back to the person of Christ. Because we're going to hit and miss. Jesus will always push you further than you're ready to go. You will acknowledge something. You will say, Jesus, I believe. And then the very next breath, Jesus is going to ask you to do something. And you say, that's a dumb idea. I think I'm ready to fold on death. I'm ready. My orientation, my paper just folds there. And so we say no to Jesus, or we say that's a dumb idea. You don't recognize how powerful death is? Like, he stinks. And Jesus is saying, like, are you being silly? Like, what did we just talk about? And that's what isn't that what you do? Isn't that what I do that? Like, we say we believe, and then we go, I believe, and we get up, and our spine turns to jelly, and it's like we don't believe at all. And we have to become content with that's the way the Christian growth happens. We keep taking those small steps, and we keep growing, and the day will come when we will be absolutely certain that Jesus is alive on both sides, and it fundamentally changes everything. So let's go to the next person in the story. This is Mary. Mary had an emotional objection to Jesus not coming to heal her brother. It says this: Mary reached the place where Jesus was. The verse right before that, it says that Martha went to Mary and said, Jesus is asking for you. See, when Jesus was coming, Martha got up and went out to Jesus, and Mary stayed put. And I wonder why. I wonder if it was because of her emotional fear that Jesus didn't care about her. Like, why don't you care about me? Like, do I not matter to you? Do we not matter to you? And so she sits there in her grief. And it's like, I'm not sure, but as soon as Jesus asks for her, she gets up and she goes out to Jesus right away. And she breaks down. And she says, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. She says the same thing Martha did, but she says it from the emotional space, not the philosophical. And Jesus, what did he do? He meets her right in the middle of her emotion. He doesn't scold her. He doesn't tell her that she ought not to feel what she feels. It actually says that Jesus wept. He saw the weeping of Mary. He saw the weeping of all the people. He sees your tears. He sees your sorrows. He sees your brokenness. He sees your pain. He sees you suffering. And he suffers with you. He grieves with you. It says that Jesus wept. From the way I understand, when scholars talk about the original language, this isn't that Jesus just choked up a little bit. This is a statement that Jesus had a breakdown, that he was emotionally distraught. He saw the pain, like he recognizes how painful and difficult it is to be bent. This is not his creative intention for you. He recognizes how deeply painful it is to be broken and fooled on death being ultimate reality. And he weeps. He weeps because he also knows that he isn't going to just stand on both sides, but that he's going to go through it. There's a foreshadow of what's coming. Jesus is going to be going into that tomb real soon. Jesus is going to be going through suffering, untold suffering. Jesus is going to be cut off from the Father. Jesus is going in and he weeps because he knows how painful death and suffering is, and he meets them in their grief. Jesus, in essence, says, yes, I will go with you through it. That changes everything. That's the message? Like, that message changes everything. The reality that Jesus walks with us, the reality that Jesus is with us gives us hope to hold on. Doesn't take away all the pain. We recognize that there's more to the story. The story isn't done yet. So let's look at the last group of people. This is the crowd. They're fickle. They're really concerned about the practical implications of things. This is the pragmatic objection to Jesus. The lesson that we learn is that he dismantles regimes of oppression. That Jesus standing on both sides of death is the greatest threat to oppressors. It's the greatest threat to totalitarian regimes. It's the greatest threat to that which holds people under. Because do you know what? What are our politicians doing to us right now? In essence, our politicians today and this has been true across human history and across countries, but our politicians in this very day use the reality of death as the ultimate reality to convince you to follow them. They're in essence saying, if you vote for the Democrats, you are voting to destroy our country. You think of all the things that you'll hear the Republican politicians say if you vote Democrat. They're going to tell you all the things that you fear. They're going to tell you the way things are going to be destroyed and the way things are going to die, and they're using fear of death to get you to follow them. Well, let's just flip the script. What do the Democrats say to the people who are going to vote Republican? It's the same thing. It's the same script. And it's two groups of people using the fear of death and the reality of death and dying to their advantage, to get you to follow them in being oriented to death. This is why Christianity has always been a threat to political regimes. It is why the Christian faith has overturned totalitarian regimes across the world and across human history, because Jesus stands alive on both sides of death. His followers do not fall for those tactics. And they do not fold on those lines. And if you fold on those lines, you have to ask yourself some hard questions. Like, are you orienting yourself to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, or are you going to orient yourself to the death and dying regimes of human government? The gospel of Jesus Christ and the church of Jesus Christ will always be a threat because Jesus stands alive. And so this is what we see. But some of them in the crowd said, "Could he who not opened the eyes of the blind man kept this man from dying?" What's their concern? Pragmatic. Like, come on, Jesus, like, if you healed some blind people, certainly you could have done it here. And if you can't do it here, well, maybe then I won't follow you. But if you just get your act together and be consistent and get it right and make it practical for me, then I'd be happy to follow you. And then some will turn and they go to the Pharisees and say what Jesus has done. And they're not certain. They don't know which one to follow. They don't know. Do they want to align with their political leaders where they have a sense of security and a sense of power, or do they want to align with Jesus? And people are divided. They don't know. Some do, some don't. And they go to the leaders, and they went to the Pharisees and said what Jesus has done. And it says that from that day on, they plotted about how they're going to take out Jesus. This is the beginning of Jesus' march to the cross. What they don't realize is that they're participating in the very thing where Jesus is going to go through, and he's going to swallow him up. He's going to swallow up death, and he's going to come out alive on the other side. That's the message. That's the message of the gospel of Jesus. It's the best message. It's the message that redeems us. It's the message that fundamentally will change you. And again, it's not about application. It's about a fundamental belief. This is why Jesus was so adamant in each part of this story. Jesus is saying that you might believe, that you might believe. He meets you in all of these areas so that you believe. Because it is your belief that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that reorients you, and it radically changes your life. So let's go to the last character in the story. Jesus stands at the grave of Lazarus. I think we can say Jesus stands at our grave, my grave, at your grave. And he says, take away the stone, because I'm going to call you out. You. Not just Lazarus. He's going to call you, and he's going to call me to come out of that grave. We will stand alive with Jesus on both sides. And so Jesus is standing there, and he cries out, and again the scriptures talk about that he shouted, that he commanded, that he raised his voice. He raised the voice that called the moon and the stars into being. The one that created the galaxies, who created us. He raised that same voice, and he yells, Lazarus, come forth. Tim, come forth. Come out of the grave. Come out of your grave. Come forth. And out comes Lazarus. Out comes you and me. Jesus has the authority to call you out of the grave. And he has. And he is. And he's beckoning you, come out of the grave. And then he gives this most fascinating statement. We're going to spend all morning just on this one part. He says to the people there, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Why didn't Lazarus just take off the grave clothes? Why did people have to be involved in that? I believe what Jesus is saying is that we are so oriented to death that we can't do life by ourselves. If we are by ourselves and we try to solve all of our own problems, we will never get out of the stench of death. The grave clothes represent that 4 days of stink. You and I stink. We reek of death. We still do. We break on that line so many times. How many times do we orient ourselves to death, to our orientation to things not being okay? We orient ourselves that way and we reek of death. So many of our relationship struggles, so many of our life problems, so many things reek of death. And Jesus is saying, you can't take off your grave clothes yourself. You need the people in your life. I need you to challenge me to be oriented to life, to be oriented to what does the gospel say to us? What is it? What does it mean to orient your life? Whatever you're going through in life, what does it mean for Jesus to stand on both sides of the grave? That's not just a simple question to answer. It's like we got to wrestle with that day in and day out. What does it mean? And we need each other to take off the grave clothes, because if we don't, we will remain entangled in the stench of death. I think that's spiritual formation and that's growth in the Christian community, is our grave clothes are coming off. They're not the whole way off yet. We're still in the process, but they have to come off. If not, we will continue to experience the stench of death. One last thing before we transition into communion time. Jesus is doing something in Lazarus' story. Can you imagine being Lazarus and being like, I'm sick, I'm dying, and I would really like Jesus to come, and he doesn't come. And he doesn't come. And he doesn't come. How many of you have ever prayed and prayed and prayed, and Jesus just doesn't come? He doesn't come yet. And he dies. He goes right into death. See, Jesus is doing something way beyond just your story. Jesus said on multiple occasions, in all the characters of the story, Jesus is saying, I'm glad that we didn't go. I'm glad because this facilitates your belief. When I think about it, it's like Jesus let Lazarus die to facilitate my belief. I don't know that I like that if I'm Lazarus. That makes sense when Jesus knows he lives on both sides. It's like we can trust him. We can trust that something is going on in our story, in the middle of our suffering, in the middle of our grief and loss. We won't be able to see what it is. Lazarus never could see. He didn't see it. He didn't know all the things that were going on in his story. He just died. There are many things that are going on in your story, within your suffering, within your pain, that you have no idea how the Lord might be working all around you. Do you trust him? Will you stay grounded that the Lord is doing something that's way more, and that he has you, and that he will be with you and go with you through suffering and through death? Because we're going to all suffer. Jesus says it. In this world you will have suffering. We have to confront it. And that's the beauty of the God. The church does not shrink back from the reality of human suffering. It moves straight into it and straight through it with people. Do you trust him? Do you believe that Jesus stands on both sides? Worship team, or Joel, you can come on up. And we're going to celebrate communion this morning. So, what we're going to do when we take communion is we make the declaration that we believe that Jesus lives on both sides of death. Do you realize what we celebrate in the church and what we call things like Good Friday? Like, that's a terrible day. That was the day that it looked like death completely swallowed up life, and it didn't. And so we celebrate Good Friday because Jesus actually swallows up death. And then Jesus turns around and he says, how about you take the bread, which represents my broken body on the cross, and how about you drink this cup, which represents my shed blood? That's Jesus saying, I'm not shrinking back from suffering and death. We're actually going to take in death and come out alive. Like, we switch the polarities. Like, God is saying, oh no, let's come to the table. Let's celebrate the death of Jesus. Let's celebrate the resurrection, because we're going to go with Jesus from one side the whole way through to the other. And that's what this represents. So if you believe, come to the table and take the bread and take the cup. Do you believe it? Let that message radically transform your life. Let's pray. Lord, I ask that you would continue to walk with us through the sorrows, the griefs, the challenges, the fears, the anxieties, the objections to our belief. I pray that you would refine us, that you would give us courage to obey, to walk in the light, to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. I pray that you would empower us to walk with others through their suffering, to not shrink back, but to walk with confidence and hope that you stand alive on both sides. In Jesus' name, amen. Mike and Don will be sharing the elements this morning, and so if you can just make your way down the sides and then back to your table. The Lord bless and keep you, cause his face to shine on you, and give you peace.